impact of that on gender equality and economic empowerment of women. So, Elaine, should I stay here? I'm happy to.
Thanks so much, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for coming, but also I would like to particularly thank Ella Hopkins for Bretton Woods Project, who invited me. She's in the back. And at the beginning and the end, I'm going to just give a little plug to her new publication, the Bretton Woods Project's new publication, Gender Just Macroeconomics. And there are some copies right over there on the side, on top of the heater. And I'd also would like to thank Sophie Effange, who also invited me. She's from Christian Aid, she's not here. All right, I prepared many remarks, so just cut me off when my time is up. I'll also try to skip a bit. But let me tell you that the inviters asked me specifically to talk on a couple of topics. The first one is how the privatization has been set by the global financial institutions, that is the international financial institutions that I'll call the IFIs today. And they asked me specifically also to talk on background on the very long ago created structural adjustment programs and the Washington Consensus. So that's one area they asked me to talk about. And then secondly, they asked me to discuss the World Bank's more recent work on privatization, especially the continued push for public-private partnerships, PPPs, and their impacts on women and on women's rights. Could I just ask for a show of hands of how many people have background on the international financial institutions? Okay, I would say that was a third to a half, so I'm just going to say a handful of sentences for those who haven't been following the international financial institutions, or IFIs. They're the largest public development funders that are taxpayer supported. They declare that their mission is to end poverty and economic growth, but really their undeclared mission is to generate private corporate profits. And being banks, they make mostly loans. Basic IFI facts, they're owned by governments. The World Bank has 189 member countries, consisting of borrower, debtor countries, and exactly, that's right, and the countries that make loans, or creditor countries. Besides the World Bank and the IMF that founded right after World War II, there are a bunch of regional development banks, the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank. I could go on and on. Ask me questions during Q&A if you want to know specifically about any of them. Okay, that's the intro to IFIs. So now, the first question I was asked to discuss was how the privatization agenda has been set by the IFIs, and some brief background on structural adjustment loans and the Washington Consensus. So when we discuss IFI privatization, we actually have to go back to the G20 governments. It's the G20, those governments, notably their heads of state and their finance ministers, who give the marching orders to the international financial institutions. And they are mightily influenced, the G20 and the IFIs, by the corporations who they serve. In the old days, the IFIs had a much heavier public sector focus than they have today. They are becoming more and more private sector focused, and we'll get into that. And I know this firsthand because when I heard China was joining the World Bank in 1980, having a China background, I applied to work on China at the World Bank and did so. I never heard of structural adjustment loans in 1980, but they unfolded while I was in the bank, although I didn't work on them because China wasn't getting structural adjustment loans. However, in by the mid-'80s, I read this volume that came out of here, the UN, UNICEF's 3-volume set called Adjustment with a Human Face, which looked at impacts on women and girls with case studies, very harmful impacts on women and girls of structural adjustment loans financed by the World Bank and also the International Monetary Fund. Banks. And these IFIs, thanks to civil society pressure, all have gender policies. They all have environmental and social standards or safeguards. When they make loans through financial intermediaries, i.e. commercial banks and other financial intermediary entities, those financial intermediaries totally, according to our findings, ignore those policies of the IFIs, be they gender, other social, or environmental policies. So keep that in mind. Now some examples are going to be primarily from Africa, it turns out, but some others. Over the years, I'm going to use as our example Gender Action's work looking at IFI-financed extractive industries. We did field work in the Central Asian, in West African, Chad Cameroon pipelines financed by the World Bank and the EIB, the West African gas pipelines that covers about 5 West African countries. We found that in every case, and they were co-financed, by the way, by BP, Exxon, and Shell, the IFIs and BP, Exxon, and Shell. So the IFI projects, they eliminated women's farming and fishing livelihoods. Even though we don't want people to take jobs in extractive industries, they employed males almost exclusively in building the pipelines and even in office jobs. Women did not get jobs. This increased women's dependence on men. There was a massive increase of trafficking in women. Pipelines, when they're built, also have roads built along them, and the roads were used for trafficking in women. Violence against women increased, and stillbirths dramatically increased. Stillbirths because of leaks from the pipelines. 2 years ago, I visited Nigeria's Niger Delta to look at the project sites. And this was a few years after the projects had already been financed. We found such dead land from the oil and gas pipelines that not a woman, not a man, not a fish or a fly could exist. It's just complete deadness. And me and my women colleagues from the region were confronted by militarized security people who were carrying massive guns pointed at us. It was totally terrifying. There's a huge militarization impact. I also wanted to share similar but not identical impacts of the South Africa Medupi coal plant that the World Bank financed, but my time has run out, so I'm not going to do so. But I will jump in my last minute to talking about the fact that in 2006, Gender Action did a little guide, 2006, called Gender Guide to World Bank and IMF Policy-Based Lending. And I'm quoting verbatim 2 facts that are so relevant to today's panel. The first one is VATs fall heaviest on women, quoting verbatim from our 2006 report. Many IMF and World Bank loan conditionalities force governments to increase revenue by imposing value-added taxes, VATs, on goods and services. These VATs, I just want to skip through to the key part. They're very highly regressive, and their burden falls most heavily on women. And then the second fact.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for setting the pace and really for emphasizing how there's been a continued push for PPPs and the impact of that on women. So I'll move the microphone to our next speaker, who is called Corina Rodriguez, and she's going to give us reflections from the Latin America region. Corina is a feminist economist, and she's a researcher at the National Council of Research based in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She's a lecturer as well and has worked as a consultant for many international organizations. So she's going to give us reflections from Latin America, as I've said, and to also link more broadly to the shift towards neoconservatism and authoritarian regimes within the region. And Junea, who is also in the panel, they are both going to give us examples from the region and how really feminist movements from the region are responding to some of these challenges. So, Corina?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks all for coming to this conversation. As Elaine has just said, privatization is not a new trend. Private sector greed for growing benefits has always been there, and in fact it is at the heart of capitalism. And privatization is based on a strong narrative that says the state has no money, the state is inefficient, and markets are the best way to organize the economy. And this narrative was very, very strong in the 90s in Latin America through these structural adjustment policies that we have just heard about, structural adjustment programs. And in that time, in Latin America, many economic and social sectors were totally privatized. In my country, Argentina, all public services enterprises were privatized, and electricity, water, gas, lobby and bribery and the financial support to political parties and electoral campaigns, but also the more newer revolving door where people from the companies go into government and then come back. And in this context, there is a growing and renewed push for privatization across the world and also in Latin America. And this is really sad in the case of Latin America because in the early 2000s, many of our countries had been like in a break with a recovery of the legitimacy of the state intervention, with increasing public expenditure and with expansion of social benefits, including conditional cash transfers and care provision. To give you an extreme example, in my country where the pension system had been privatized in the 90s, it was re-statized in the 2000s. And now we have a public pension system which is again under the threat of privatization. And during this break in Latin America, and because of public intervention and increasing public expenditure and the expansion of social protection coverage, women's lives improved. Their rights were enforced, their living conditions were better. They have access to income, there was reduction on extreme poverty, care issues were put in the table, and social protection benefits were extended. However, the root of the development model did not change. On the contrary, there was a reinforcement of an extractivist model that makes our economies dependent in many different ways, that creates little opportunities, employment opportunities for women, that displaces populations and ruins livelihoods, and destroys the environment. And in this context, we are now, unfortunately, in this shift, we are facing a very dangerous pushback, both in economic and political terms. Economic and political, of course, are interlinked. In economic terms, there is a combination of worsening of the international context and a return of neoliberal macro policies, fiscal austerity, inflation targets, deregulation, privatization. And in political terms, there is a very, very worrying shift, not only to the right, I would say in some countries, to fascism. And probably my colleague from Brazil will talk better about that. Human rights-based approaches are threatened. Universalism as a paradigm is under dispute. And of course, women's human rights are also on dispute and threatened, mostly sexual and reproductive rights. And to give you a concrete example about how the international financial institutions that we were hearing about are not neutral to this shift, and how they're reusing old ways to push for this privatization agenda, I can give you the example of my own country. One of the first decisions of we have a shift in the government in 2015, and it was the first time that in my country an explicit right-wing party went into power by elections. We have dictatorships and other ways of having these people on board, but this was the first time that citizenship elected a right-wing government. And one of the first decisions of the new government in Argentina 3 years ago was to reduce export taxes, which means to reduce the burden on those who are the one providing most of the external financing of the country, being a primary goods export-led economy. And there was a growing process of defunding. So after being a decade without borrowing to the IMF, Argentina got the greatest loan with a package of conditionalities. So there was a process of defunding and the need to get again into the debt process. And of course, this loan came with the traditional conditionalities: fiscal authority and reforms, taxation reform, labor reform, and pension system reform. In taxation, with a narrative of an excessive burden that is discouraging private investment, corporate taxation and export taxes were cut. And at the same time, subsidies to access public services were also cut back, and therefore user fees increased in a country that have already privatized all the public services companies. In terms of the labor reform, of course, the paradigm is the flexibility, and in terms of the pension system, the paradigm is privatization. But the Argentinian government couldn't go so far because there is social resistance. And then I'll come to my last point, which is how can we resist and how can we reclaim public policies for people's rights, and how can we reclaim that these public services are funded through tax justice. I think it is, I would like to say two things. One is building a counter-narrative, or as we are saying in this panel, shifting the narrative. And for this, I think that we need evidence-based feminist approach to all these issues. And I think we are in the process of building this counter-narrative with a feminist perspective. And the second thing is organizing. And I think we need, and we are organizing at different levels, local, regional, and global. I think we need, and we are articulating with other social movements, alliances with key actors, I think are especially relevant. I think we need to go through a process of training ourselves about these issues and dissemination information. And I also think that we need a strong communication strategy, as the one we are having this week with our campaign. And I will finish by giving you very short examples about this organizing. The Gender Anti-Taxation Working Group at the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, where we are trying to push for a gender lens and a feminist approach to tax issues. The Feminist for Biden Treaty, a group of feminists that are following the process to the construction of a Biden Treaty on business and human rights. And the example of the social mobilizing that we have during the last WTO meeting previous year in Buenos Aires, and the G20 meeting last year in Buenos Aires. We organized a feminist forum. We not only try to influence in the discussion, but we basically occupy the streets, and we made people know in our country, which is in the G20, but it's a country from the south, how the G20 policies and their agenda of privatization is affecting women's lives.
Thank you very much, Corina, for that quite incisive presentation and reflections from Latin America. Clearly, you've ended on a very high note that how can we really reclaim public services for public good? And on that note, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Jeannie, who's going to give us reflections from Asia so that we can also see what's happening within the region. And she has a number of short clips that we are going to share with you and to further really elaborate her experiences within Asia. So as I set up the film, maybe Jimmy, you can introduce your presentation.
Good afternoon, sisters. I represent two organizations here, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. They're part of the Jubilee South history. And the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, who is a member of the DATJ. So I would, as part of my presentation, I would just like to share with you a few voices and key messages from grassroots women in the Philippines. The first clip, I think you will see street vendors. Han was just texting me to say there's water shortage in my area. It is not true that it is more efficient. It has also caused in other countries the loss of jobs for women, where in the public sector, as you know, women are also overrepresented. Women workers in the public sector have lost their jobs because of privatization. And then you will see again later what is the narrative that the women are trying to, grassroots women are trying to change in terms of tax policies, or what the IFIs are saying, that the value-added taxes is a better policy to mobilize domestic revenues. And this is what you will hear from the women. Is it working? It's out of range, but not. There it goes.
Karapatan ng kababaihan. Karapatan ng kababaihan. Karapatan ng kababaihan. Karapatan ng kababaihan. Buwis sa makataon at paglaban. Ang kababaihan ay siyang humahanap ng paghirap sa tahanan. Sila yung nagsiservisyo sa kanilang mga asawa. Lagyan ng laman ng sigmura ng bawat isa, bawat mga anak namin, buwisan pa. Bigyan hustisya ang pangungulita ng buwis. Dapat wala na yung mga buwis na yan. Ang dapat papasan niya sa mga buwis, ang dapat na buwisan ay yung mga mayaman, hindi yung mga mahirap. Hindi yung mga kagaya namin na makarampot lang yung mga kinikita namin sa mga bangketa. Maliit na halaga yan, ang dapat magbuwis, yung mga mayaman, bumibili ng kotse. Hanap naman kami magpapa-hospital kasi makarampot lang ang kinikita ng mga asawa namin. Alalayan ang trabaho ng mga kababaihan. Bigyan ng servisyon publiko. Saka ang mararapat lang sa mga kababaihan, bigyan sila ng magandang hanap buhay. Dapat, paano talaga na may magandang servisyo yung mga kababaihan? Yung magandang servisyo, gaya ng edukasyon, magkaroon ng magandang hanap buhay. Halimbawa, at trabaho na marangal. Hindi kagaya ng magtutinda kami sa lansana na hakulin kami ng liit, tatakbo naman. Ako takutin. Dapat yung mga trendo na tanggalin na para hindi maghirap yung mga taong naghihirap. Karapatan ng kababaihan, buwis na makatarungan ipaglaban. Buwis na makatarungan ipaglaban.
We
we promise them that they will be with us. At least their voices. And then there is another one from other countries. Very short.
Women do unpaid care work, so reduce unfair tax burden on women.
We want tax exemption on all the food items and accessories. For example, oil, LPG, gas, daily food items such as wheat and rice, they're really expensive and the tax on them is really expensive.
We have to ensure that our Malaysian fiscal policies recognizes the unpaid care work that is being done by women and also undertake gender responsive budgeting.
Thank you. The first, going back to the last video clip, Rumi from Bangladesh, they're fighting for tax VAT exemption for female-headed households. No? So there's a way to do that because tax policies have the VAT especially has become a burden to women. Shalini from India, the second woman who spoke, she organizes women workers in a sanitary napkin factory, and they're also working for sanitary napkins to be exempted from VAT because she says the women who are working in the sanitary napkin factory cannot also even afford to buy those sanitary napkins that they themselves are producing. And as you already heard, Shalini from Malaysia, they are also working for recognition of the unpaid care work that women are doing, and in fact do not even get counted, or the profits that multinational companies are really amassing also rests on the unpaid care work that women are giving. So last March 8, on International Women's Day, the women street vendors, hundreds of them marched and to the streets to stage a protest action and to make their demands for democracy, for gender equality, and including just taxes. The tax law that they're talking about in the Philippines, so for the past 2 years, the new administration introduced what's called a TRAIN, tax reform for acceleration and inclusion. It's a little bit deceptive because it was the government said that it's supposed to be more inclusive. But what has happened since then is because it increased the taxes on petroleum products, the problem is it was passed on to the consumers, and that is it triggered a series of inflation, high prices of basic commodities, which really hit women very badly, especially women from the informal economy like the street vendors whom you saw. So yesterday I saw news that our tax agency is also now going to audit the gasoline companies to make sure that they are reporting their taxes very well. So let us see what happens after that. But that is only one side of the story. Now they can audit because there are so many ways that a very urgent and complex struggle for women across the world. And yes, thank you very much for giving me this time, Carol.
Thank you very much, Jeannie, for sharing those exciting examples from Asia. And also the emphasis on social movement building, because that really is a way of bringing change and shifting the narrative. Next, we have Junea. Junea is Spanish speaking, but we are lucky enough to... Oh, sorry. Portuguese. Yes, we are lucky to have a translator in the room, so I'll invite her to come over. She will be interpreting for us Junea's presentation. Let me just pull it up. Nacional since 1988, and she's also a trade unionist. She's the vice president of the World Women's Committee at PSI and the head of the National Women's Secretariat at CAT. So, Linnea.
Boa tarde. Good afternoon. Bueno, yo voy a hablar un texto porque si no Amelie va a me ayudar aquí con la interpretación. Entonces voy a hablar dos cosas. Hay preguntas que me pidieron en ActionAid, pero si tuviéramos tiempo para el debate, puede ser que yo pueda contestar alguna. Voy a hablar sobre el caso de Perú, que es Servicios Públicos Básicos, Evasión y Ilusión Tributária, que fue un estudio durante 10 años y el impacto en las mujeres y niñas. Y también voy a hablar muy rápidamente sobre la situación en Brasil con las reformas estructurantes.
Okay, so just so you know, I'm not a professional translator, so I'll do my best. So she said that she will be talking about the report was made in Peru, the case of Peru. Basic public services, tax evasion and tax avoidance was made between 2006 and 2016, and the impact of women and girls. And she will briefly talk about the situation in Brazil as well as the reform about the structure of public services in Brazil.
Bueno, según el estudio, existe una relación directa entre la recaudación y asignación de gastos públicos. Yo me gusta decir inversiones, investimentos en los servicios básicos. Es así que una otra conclusión del estudio para un caso peruano durante 10 años del año 2006-2016 es que una mayor recaudación trae o permite un mayor gasto público y por ende aumenta las opciones de que se expanda el gasto social.
So the report in question established a direct relationship between the revenue collected through taxation and the allocation of public money to basic services. So it says basically that if we had higher tax revenue, it will allow an increase in public spending and including expenditure on social services. Sorry.
En el periodo analizado, que como dijo 2006-2016, se encuentra que los valores del índice de incumplimiento tributario oscilan entre, 46.1% y 57.3% para el impuesto a la renta y el 29.2% y el 40.2% para el impuesto general de ventas. Eso es terrible.
Donc, c'est terrible le rapport. Sorry, French. Sorry, I went back to my own language. So she said it's terrible that the report. Sorry, I said I was not a professional. So the report said that unpaid taxes during this period varied between 46% and 57%, more or less, in the case of income taxes, and between 29% and 40% for VAT.
Este comportamento refleja a pouca efetividade da política tributária em reduzir a evasão e a elusão, situação que afeta a disponibilidade de fundos para financiar o presupuesto público e melhorar o gasto em los serviços públicos básicos.
So this reflects the ineffectiveness of authorities' attempt to reduce tax evasion and avoidance, since it was such a huge percentage of taxes that weren't paid. So the state of affairs limits the availability of funds for the national budget and therefore for basic public services.
¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que com o monto no recaudado, devido ao incumprimento tributário, se habría podido mais que duplicar o presupuesto asignado a los servicios sociales, beneficiando as possibilidades de mejora en la calidad de vida